Greetings from Geneva, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this press briefing. Once again, we're providing an update on the COVID-19 situation in airlines. Today, we have a lineup that will start with some research that we've done recently on attitudes towards travel restrictions, travel trends, and travel apps. Our Senior Vice President for Airport Passenger Cargo and Security will give us a brief update on the IATA Travel Pass project. Alexandre de Juniac, our Director General and CEO, will give a few short comments to wrap things up. And then, as usual, we'll throw it open to questions via the chat function. My name is Tony Consul. I'm the Head of Communications here at IATA. I'll start by presenting the recent research that we have done. This data comes from a fifth wave of passenger research that we've been doing since the beginning of the crisis. The first wave was in February 2020, so right at the beginning of the crisis, then April, June, and September. The data we're presenting today was canvassed between 15 and 23 February, so just a couple of weeks ago. It surveyed 4,700 travelers in 11 markets. Those markets are Chile, US, Canada, UK, France, Germany, UAE, India, Singapore, Japan, and Australia. To qualify for the survey, people had to have taken a flight at least once since mid-2019, so within 6 months of the crisis having started. The survey was done by Rockland Dutton, a US firm, with the data collection contracted to IATA. And today we'll present a small part of that survey, which is focused on attitudes to travel restrictions, travel trends, and travel apps. So the first slide I want to show you was an attempt to try and get a sense of how travel restrictions are impacting people. And as you see on the left, about 68% of respondents to the survey indicated that travel restrictions are negatively impacting their quality of life. You can see that in the pie chart, and in that you'll see the dark blue at 27%. Those are people who strongly agree with that statement. So this is a very deep sentiment. And we wanted to understand what was driving that. And so we gave people a few options to choose from, and they could choose all that they wanted. So there are no restrictions. And in that, you can see that the strongest response told us that people were missing their family and the sense of freedom that flying brings. Both of those came in around 46%. Then at 38%, we saw an indication that the restrictions are causing mental stress from feeling contained. And there was an equally strong response indicating that people had missed some special moments, weddings, funerals, family gatherings, and things like that. And then we had a few responses showing that the disruption to business as a result of the travel restrictions is felt at the individual level. About 36% said that they could not do business normally, and 30% felt that the impact of not being able to connect professionally with other people. So what we can see from that then is that the travel restrictions have had social, health, and economic impacts on people. In the next slide, we wanted to explore how people were feeling about managing the risks of COVID-19 when it comes to travel. And here we got some very strong responses. On the top left, you'll see that 87% agreed that we need to manage the COVID-19 risks in order to live and travel normally. And an even stronger number, 88%, agreed that we must balance managing COVID risks and getting the economy moving again. An almost equally strong response, 85%, agreed that governments should set targets or milestones to reopen borders. It was suggested that these could be based on testing capacity or vaccination distribution. About 80% agreed that borders should be opened progressively as COVID-19 cases decrease, and 71% agreed that border closures should end as testing and vaccine capacity increases. What we are seeing in this then is a general trend that says that travelers see a need to manage COVID-19 risks, balance that, and would like to see governments plan a reopening around testing and vaccination milestones. And if you've been following us for the past weeks, that's been a very strong call from our organization to governments to have a plan to reopen. What we're also seeing in this is a little bit of impatience. If you look in the left-hand column, 62% showed frustration at border closures, and 49% believe that the restrictions have gone too far. If we look at the next slide, we wanted in this to understand if these attitudes towards the risks of COVID were being reflected in how people or when people would anticipate returning to travel. And in this, if you add up the top two categories, so those who would not wait at all or wait a month or two before they start to travel, we see that 57% should be back traveling within a few months of the virus being contained. We've been tracking this since the April wave, and as you can see on the right, 57% puts us very close to where we were in April 2020, where 61% anticipated returning within a couple of months of the pandemic being contained. In between, it dropped to as low as 45% in June, improved a little bit to 49% in September, and the jump to 57% in February, I think, is significant. In the next slide, we wanted to ask some questions to understand what might be driving some of these attitudes to travel. One thing that is very strong is the sentiment that people will not travel in significant numbers if it involves quarantine. 84% said that. And if you look at the blue part of that top bar, at 48%, you see that that's one of the strongest responses that we've had in this survey. So people feel very strongly, and we see that also in the travel numbers, that they will not travel if quarantine is involved. Also on the topic of quarantine, when we asked travelers how they felt about negative PCR tests or negative testing and vaccination, they believed in about 2/3 of the respondents that these, if a person tests negative or if a person has been vaccinated, they should not have to be put into quarantine as part of the travel process. We also found a few positive drivers for demand. If you look at the 72% figure there, that's the number of people who want to travel as soon as possible once the virus is contained in order to see their friends and family. And that's up significantly from September when the number was 63%. Another encouraging number is the 81% at the very bottom who believe that being vaccinated will make them more likely to travel. And we also see an improvement in some of the negative indicators. So we see, for example, 62% seeing themselves traveling less for business this year. Obviously, that's a concern, but I should note that it's down from 72% in September. Similarly, 56% plan to postpone their travel until the economy stabilizes. That's a significant number, but it's also down from 65% in September last year. The last slide that I'll show has data looking at what we see as a key element to the return to travel, and that's travel apps to manage travel health credentials. The top line message here is that we believe travelers will use apps if they are required and available. 80% told us that they were encouraged by the prospect and want to use it as soon as possible. The other message that comes from this, however, is that they have some conditions. 78% want to control their own data, and 59% don't want the data to reside in a central database. For those that have been following the developments on IATA Travel Pass, this is reflected in the core design elements of the project. More good news is that 77% trust airlines to manage the process, and 80% want this integrated into their favorite airline's app. And the last point is that the survey respondents expect global standards. At 89%, They believe that governments should standardize vaccine and testing certificates. Again, if you've been following us recently, you'll know that this is a really important ask that we have made of governments and continue to make. These slides will be on our website. I realize I've gone through them relatively quickly. They'll be on the website for reference after this call, and we'll also have a release that will capture some of the key elements of that. I'll now give the floor to Nick Careen, our Senior Vice President for Airports, Passenger, Cargo and Security, who will give us a brief update on the Travel Pass. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Tony. So, as Tony mentioned, I'd like to give you three quick updates this week in terms of Travel Pass. We'd like to touch a little bit on the new pilot partners that we've announced recently, as well as a little bit more detail in terms of the first live trial, and touch on some of our ongoing advocacy efforts. So in terms of the last couple of weeks, we've announced pilots from Qantas, Gulf Air, Air Baltic, which goes along with the airlines that you see before you on the slide, and more to come. The interest continues to grow in terms of these additional trials as we move forward. And we also have, what's important as well, is significant increase around the globe in terms of government support. We've recently had support from the Latvian government as well as the Panamanian government, who have come out and publicly endorsed the Travel Pass. The discussions with key governments and UN institutions have one simple message, and that is that the Travel Pass is a key to reopening borders, but also that timing is absolutely critical. And without a properly integrated system in place, the return to service will be operationally unsustainable. So, in terms of the next slide, in terms of the live trial that I'd mentioned, we just recently announced Singapore Airlines will be the first airline to pilot the full solution. We'll be doing that on the Singapore to London route from the 15th to 28th of March. So it's important that Singapore Airlines have been involved with the concept right from the beginning, and so this is an important milestone for both of us, and it will really test the solution from one end to the other. So in terms of process, the passengers will be invited to download the Travel Pass app, create a digital identity, and which will be with their profile photo as well as passport and flight information. They can then book their pre-departure COVID test from one of the clinics, which will be available on a dedicated online portal. When they get to the clinic, they will be able to use their digital identity as well as their flight information to register for the test. The results will be sent securely to them via the app on the phone. The passenger will receive a confirmation of their status to fly, and that is then verified by the IATA's thematic registry, which will subsequently give them the okay to travel. So the pilot scheme will pave the way, as we've been saying all along, to the integration of digital health verification processes into the Singapore Air mobile app eventually, which we're targeting somewhere in the mid-2021. And again, we'll be utilizing the entire IATA Travel Pass framework. Our partnership with Singapore Airlines for the first full deployment of the Travel Pass will help get the world flying again, as we'd mentioned. And in the immediate term, this solution for the travelers to safely and securely manage their health credentials. In the longer term, this digital identity elements of the Travel Pass will place Singapore Airlines passengers at the front of the queue, and even more convenient in terms of contactless travel experience and the use of biometrics. In the last slide, in terms of the advocacy, and as Tony had mentioned in the beginning, with respect to what our customers and consumers expect, there has to be global standards to securely record digital proof of verification. And this will ensure equivalence, mutual recognition, and acceptance of COVID-19 certifications when people travel around the world. The World Health Organization, ICAO, and OECD have been working on these standards, but each day without them means the challenge gets bigger. And this process needs to be accelerated. Secondly, countries need to ensure that their citizens receive a digital COVID-19 vaccination certificate when they are vaccinated, so that they have a verifiable digital document. Currently, the majority of countries are providing paper certificates, which are more susceptible to fraud and we need a plan to retrospectively apply them to record those already vaccinated. In terms of the border, we need borders and other agencies to accept digital passenger test vaccination certificates on a passenger's mobile device and not only paper as it is today. And underpinning all of this is the governments to work with industry on the creation of a roadmap to reopen international travel, to ensure that when that day comes, we are all ready, and we are ready, and for the restart in order for it to be robust and allowing for a better and faster return to the skies. Thanks, Tony. Turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Nick. I'll now turn it over to Alexandre de Juniac, our CEO and Director General, for a few short comments before we take questions. Alexandre, I think you may be on mute.
Sorry, yeah. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining this press briefing. I would like, before taking your question, to make a few comments. First of all, confidence is important. And we have confidence that people have not lost their taste for the freedom to fly. That is shown in the survey that Tony has described. Second takeaway, urgency. We must be ready when borders reopen. That means working with governments in at least two areas. First, establishing restart plans so people don't suffer the economic, health, and social cost of travel restrictions a day longer than is necessary. And developing global recognized digital standards that governments will accept as vaccination and testing credentials for travel. Third takeaway, the vulnerability. As we all know, recovery has not started. And although there will be significant demand for travel, recovery will take time. In the meantime, airlines continue to burn cash, some at dangerously high levels. The governments need to keep a watchful eye on and provide relief for those that don't have the financial means to make it through to the recovery. So that were the three quick comments I wanted to make before taking your questions with my colleague Tony and Nick. Thank you very much for your attention.
You're on mute, Tony.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Alexandre. We'll now start with the question and answer session. We have a couple of questions in the queue already, and we'll take those in order. Just a reminder, please type in your questions into the chat function. To start with, the first question is about the EU Digital Green Pass initiative. And the question is, does that help or hurt what we're trying to do with the IATA travel pass? Maybe Alexandre and Nick, did you want to comment on that?
So I didn't catch the beginning of the question.
The EU Digital Green Pass, does that help or hurt the IATA travel pass initiative? Maybe, Nick, you look anxious. Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, it'll definitely help. Any country that moves towards a digital framework and a digital standard that will allow us to be able to, citizens to receive its information digitally, which will allow us to be able to integrate it into the travel process and the app, absolutely falls well in line with what we've been advocating for all along. And so, yes, it's a good thing.
Okay. We have a question about fake vaccination certificates. Actually, two questions. First part of the question is, does IATA consider this a hazard to the establishment of travel, or the re-establishment of travel, I should say? And secondly, is this a further impetus to the IATA travel pass rollout?
I missed the first part of it, Tony, in terms of the question.
Yeah, so the increasing reports of fake vaccination certificates, is that a hazard to reestablishing travel? And secondly, is it perhaps an impetus for the IATA travel pass rollout?
Well, I think that the last part first, so absolutely. I mean, that there's many impetuses for ITP and travel pass. That's one of them. Fraud has been a problem. It's been a problem for decades when it comes to the manual processing. One recent and obvious example would be the yellow fever and how that's managed and the problems we've had with that. Try to extrapolate that over an entire planet and see what kind of a problem we're going to have pretty quickly. I mean, as I mentioned either, let's not to be lost on anyone. It's just the manual processing of paper just does not work in a restart environment, and will be completely unsustainable, unacceptable, and many other uns in terms of words that you can describe that why this needs to be digital. And then, of course, in terms of overall fraud, the verification process that we're promoting in terms of the use of the travel pass will all but eliminate that issue. And so for sure, that's something that, consumers want, but governments want as well in terms of trusting the system. And we have seen specific examples where governments do not trust the paperwork, and the result of that being lanes closed, flights canceled as a result of it. So yes, for sure, we need the digital piece is an important element of reducing fraud.
Okay. We have a question asking about how we see a restart potentially happening, and particularly with the discussions that we're seeing between countries like Cyprus, Greece, Spain, Israel, etc., looking at access for those who have been vaccinated. Do we expect to see borders reopening as a condition of vaccination? Do we see vaccination as being the biggest driver, or do we still see testing, I suppose, as playing a role in that?
I think I can jump on there and Alexandre can add to it. I think it's both, simply because the rollout of the vaccination around the world is not happening at the same pace. So for sure, we're going to see an element of both, but it does seem to be leaning much more towards vaccination certificates as being a key driver versus testing. Because let's face it, we've had testing and been promoting testing since almost a year ago. And, rapid antigen tests, as an example, were available and sustainable by, the middle of last year, yet never really became a significant part of the process. So for sure, vaccinations are very important. Do we believe it will become a condition? I mean, that's up to the governments. I mean, what we're proposing is to build a system for that inevitability, so that we can sustain it operationally and that we can have a smooth and seamless process for our consumers as well as for our airlines and airports. But ultimately, that decision rests with the government.
Okay. Alexandre, did you have anything you want to add to that?
There are two comments. First of all, it is clear that the rhythm of recovery will depend on the rollout of the vaccination policy in various countries. And this rollout will be different from one country to another, from one region of the world to another. So it is clear that vaccination and tests are going along together if we want to limit the risk of transmission of the virus from one country and one region to another, first of all. Secondly, it will depend on each state policy to decide whether or not vaccination or testing is mandatory. We see a lot of possibilities there. There are many possible outcomes of the various national policy, and it's pretty difficult to see what will happen in the near future about that.
Okay, thanks, Alexandre. I see we also have Brian Pierce on the call. I was just wondering, Brian, from your perspective, if vaccines are the real driver of restarting travel, how does that fit with our current projections?
That is what we have largely based our projections for air travel this year on. We've been looking at the pace of the rollout, which looks advanced in the developed economies, and so by the third quarter of this year, many of the developed economies should have vaccinated a large proportion, perhaps 75% of their population, which certainly should allow travel restrictions to come down. So that's what we've based the forecast on. But obviously, that does depend on governments, reacting at that point and lowering travel restrictions for international travel.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. We have a question for you, Nick, about Travel Pass, and specifically, we've announced trials, we've announced partial and full trials, but the questioner says, when will we see this actually making a difference to people traveling? When do we see the full rollout or this Travel Pass becoming a part of the travel process, not just a trial within the travel process?
Whenever governments enable it, that's as simple as that. In the current environment, certain travel restrictions continue to be in place. So whenever we start to see some international travel restrictions removed, we'll see it in greater use. So in the meantime, trials are to learn and to build on it. I think maybe not the last update, but 2 weeks ago, I think we got into a little bit more detail in terms of the versions of this app, keeping in mind that this has been a race to the finish line in terms of the development of this app, which started in the latter part of last year. And so, the appropriate time taken in the next month and a half, 2 months to perfect this thing so that it is ready when we do believe to see, to Brian's point, some of our forecasting in terms of certain parts of the world lifting those types of restrictions. So in the meantime, it will be available for download as an example in the Apple Store and as well as Google Play for Android at the beginning of next month. And so that will, it'll be out there. But again, it really is dependent on government decisions in terms of how to manage their restrictions before we begin to see it in a much wider use, given the fact that, basically 90% international traffic is still not there yet.
Great. Thanks, Nick. And just if I can push you a little bit further on that, I suppose it also means that governments need to accept the digital certifications and have the standards ready.
Yeah, I mean, that's, as we mentioned in the update at the beginning, the standards are critical here, and for that to be interoperable and harmonized around the planet, that takes a decision by the bodies that I'd mentioned. So that needs to be done sooner rather than later, and we are seeing indications that that's taking place. But like as we mentioned in the beginning, that it's not happening fast enough either. So we're going to have, and I'd mentioned this in previous weeks as well, workarounds to be able to deal with that inevitability.
Okay, thanks, Nick. We have a couple of regional questions. So the first refers to the U.S. market and wonders what the status is of any U.S. carriers joining the Travel Pass program.
Well, two major U.S. carriers are involved in the advisory group, United and American. American, most recent, have asked to participate in helping us design this. And I think I've mentioned this in previous updates as well, that we're not pulling this out of the air. We're utilizing almost 30 airlines around the world, regionally placed, to help us guide on what is required. So they're participating and helping us build this thing. We have not announced anything specifically from the U.S. yet. However, we are in discussions with some, and at the appropriate time and place, we will have more to say on that. So the simple answer is they're involved. What they're doing is they're helping us, and ultimately, as we've mentioned in the previous updates, we don't intend to be the only game in town. We just want to make sure that anyone that's in town are playing by the same rules.
Okay, thanks, Nick. And then the second region is Latin America. So we've spoken about the partnership with COPA and the Panamanian government. The questioner asks what's happening in markets, big markets like Brazil or the other major Latin American countries. Is there an evolution? Is there interest in these markets? And how do you see the governments there? Are they open to this? Are the carriers open to this? Maybe, Nick, you want to characterize that?
Yeah, there's been significant interest in South America and in the Caribbean as well. Since we're talking about that the U.S. And South American, might as well touch on the Caribbean market as well. So there is interest, but we haven't announced anything because we're not at the stage to announce yet. But there has been significant discussions and ongoing discussions with the governments in those regions, as well as the airlines in those regions as well. And this, when the time is right, we'll make further announcements. But those discussions are taking place. Yes.
Okay. And then I suppose a follow-up question would be: can the travel pass be a truly useful system if it's just in pockets of certain carriers? How does sort of the full rollout look like globally? Does it need to be universal? Can it be somewhat less than universal and still be effective?
Absolutely. I guess, if you were to distill it into some really, really basic points of what's required, I mean, if the government is going to request, and which we believe is to be the case, some form of assertion that you have had, which they do today, a test, which is manual, or a vaccination, which will, in the moment, also be manual, there will need to be processing in place that helps improve that, or it will not be unsustainable. It will not be sustainable. And I don't think can stress how bad this will be if we do not have a process in place. So that's the number one education piece for governments to say that you turn this on and we open up travel, then you're going to have miles of people lining up because we can't process them fast enough. So that's the stick or the carrot to get this thing up and running. So, and then, you need a trusted source in terms of the rules. That's Thematic looks like to be the best trusted source at the moment. And then you will need the ability to be able to generate an okay to travel. And that can be done through interoperability, open APIs, and the standard that you need from the World Health Organization and ICAO. So in the end, what we're proposing is the best, we believe, the best solution for our airlines. But there will be other solutions as long as they follow the same format and we align up properly in terms of the okay to travel and the process and the government sign off on it. It's no different than many other processes that we have that are managed by multiple vendors without issue. P&R generation being one of them, with the multiple GDSs around the world that we work with and collaborate with, or travel agents around the world we work with and collaborate. So it is easy to, once we get the standards in place, we can develop the ecosystem.
Okay, thanks, Nick. We have a question maybe for you, Alexandre. The questioner asks, we're seeing these new measures of, testing or potentially vaccination requirements being a part of the travel process. Do you see this as a temporary thing, a 1 or 2 year thing, or are we in for permanent, greater scrutinization of health credentials as part of travel?
What we think is that if the COVID-19, like any pandemic, comes under control in the majority of countries or even in the world, there is no need to maintain this type of measures. Whether it is a health passport, a sanitary control, or whatever. It's not necessary. When we had Ebola in Africa, we had control measures in the country that were involved in Ebola, and they were lifted when Ebola disappeared. It was true for when SARS happened in the country that were involved in that. So it's the same situation for COVID. If the COVID is under control, there is no need to maintain these type of control measures.
Tony, if I could build on that only because of the differentiation, maybe to take the opportunity to two things in terms of the travel pass as well. I mean, I completely agree with Alexandre, obviously, not only because he's my boss, but I completely agree with the fact that is the case, that this won't be here forever. But one thing is really, really important that we all need to, and hopefully it's never in our lifetime. I think I'm old enough that it won't be. But when this happens again, we need to have something in place that we're in a better position to manage it. And this, as long as we keep it in the background of being utilized and tested, this is a key in case another pandemic happens or a regional issue happens, Like we're seeing the outbreak of Ebola at the moment in Africa, and some countries looking for some support in terms of how to manage contact tracing around that. So this has elements of long that could be serving us in the future, so that we've learned from this past event. More importantly, though, is the ITP itself, the travel pass itself, has some elements that are meant to be designed to be longer term. The creation of a digital travel credential is huge for travel in the future. The use of biometrics is massive improvement for our infrastructure, for our customer processing, for efficiencies and turnaround times and all those things that go along with it. So this travel pass has been designed with key elements for sustainability and long-term use once COVID is behind us.
Okay. Nick, and just to clarify on that, irrespective of COVID happening, the digital identity and some of these other elements of the travel pass would have evolved anyway. COVID has just accelerated them. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, we've been beating that drum for 5 years, and some places are doing it. You see it on border controls where biometric is widely used, and some countries have readily accepted it, but it isn't global, and we need it to be global. So we were probably, this maybe gives us a chance to expedite the implementation of this by a couple of years, which is a good thing because the industry's on its knees, and any benefit we can give it is a good thing, and the consumers have been asking for it.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a question about cabin air quality, and it asks whether airlines are required to report the status of their cabin air quality on a regular basis. Nick, maybe you're familiar with that issue?
I think based on it's not a global requirement. I mean, we do cover it often in the IATA audit in terms of how it's managed. There are local jurisdictions that would have greater controls in place in terms of managing the air quality. Again, it's based on jurisdiction. But yeah, so there is some things in place, but I don't know universal it is.
Okay. And the question was in the context of building confidence, both regulatory and I suppose for international travelers. Certainly, one of the things that we've seen in data, and we'll talk about this in perhaps future briefings, is that we have seen confidence building in passengers about the quality of air on the aircraft, about the quality of cleanliness on the aircraft. So some of those early fears that we saw with respect to COVID-19 and transmission on board the aircraft, I won't say have gone completely, but they have improved significantly since the last time we did the survey in September last year.
Well, there's a lot of work that went into this. Like, this time last year, we were fighting over middle seats, as people will recall. And the industry came out hard for a simple fact that we knew that HEPA filters were in our aircraft. We knew that the condition of their air was acceptable. We went out and commissioned studies, whether that was with Harvard, with the USDFT. There was other organizations, Boeing and Airbus, which supported additional studies to show that cabin air quality was a standard that's well beyond any other location that we actually reside in on a day-to-day basis. So that was done. And then, everybody, the best source of truth is hindsight. And we did not see rapid spreads of COVID on any of our flights anywhere. And millions have traveled. Millions. So I think confidence built when they realized that, there was a lot of scare tactics that were put in place that were not valid in the end.
Yeah, and I think we can also mention that we have the multiple layers of protection, mask wearing on board the aircraft. So there are lots of best practices that have been introduced in order to keep travelers safe.
You get biosafety measures up the yin-yang, Tony.
Yeah. Great. We have a question also for you, Nick. And I think it's more of a clarification because the questioner is asking if we have any interest in Africa, but I know we have Rwandair as one of the airlines signed up to trial. So I guess the question could be, what is our strategy for rollout? Are we trying to get one or two key airlines in each region to help drive the rollout and lead regionally, or how do you see that working?
Yeah, when we started, as I mentioned earlier, the advisory group of airlines was based regionally. That make sure that we've got a good flavor in terms of what the regional requirements would be. and as well as the airlines that we're trialing, we're doing our best to maintain a regional perspective on it to ensure that we continue with that knowledge as we move forward. So yes, we're very interested in all regions of the world, and Africa is one of them. And we do, beyond Rwandair, have a couple of other airlines that we're speaking with, and so yeah, we continue to work with all regions of the world in terms of development of this.
Great, thank you. Alexandre, we have a question for you, which is asking about the discussions with governments on having a plan. Are you satisfied with the progress that has been made so far? And what do you see as next steps in that process?
Satisfied? Not really, because the speed of adoption by government of this reopening plan or roadmaps, whatever we call it, is much too low. We would like governments, to adopt plans much faster. But at least, we have seen the UK doing that. We hope that Germany will join in near future, and so they will pave the way for the others to follow the same path. So that's what we hope, and we are pushing in that direction.
Okay. And what is the window of opportunity? The idea of having a plan is to allow the airlines to prepare. We need 2, 3 months, 4 months understanding as to how markets might open, or how do you see that?
I'm not sure I've understood the question.
So if we're asking for a plan in order to be able to prepare, how much time does an airline or the industry need to prepare for a restart? Can we do it in a week? Do we need a month? Do we need 2 months?
No, we need a few weeks. Something around between 1 and 2 months. Because the plan will not be, a brutal acceleration from zero to something which is very significant. It will be a progressive increase in traffic.
Okay. And what are the key things that airlines need to prepare in order to restart? I suppose part of that is the aircraft, part of that is their personnel. What else do airlines need to sort of ramp up?
But they have to program the network, the destination they are going to operate. So they have to ensure that the commercialization of the air ticket is ready, the pricing. So there are a lot of commercial and marketing issue to be prepared. In addition to all the technical elements you have mentioned, pilots, aircraft, stations. So, but that is pretty classical. We know how to do that.
Okay. Nick, we have another question for you on the digital vaccine certificate or smart vaccine certificate. Is that a game stopper if it doesn't happen for the rollout of the travel pass, or are there workarounds for that?
Well, it's not a showstopper. No, I mean, ideally, it becomes a little more challenging in terms of mutual recognition and interoperability when you have variations in forms being utilized. But that's not the first time this industry's had to deal with that either. Which speaks to the earlier question in terms of what does the industry need? We need some time to be prepared to do this right. It's simple as that. It's easy to shut it down. It's not so easy to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And so the time needs to be prepared for it, which is to Alexandre's point. Step up and let's work backwards on that. But if we don't have a certificate, we will have optical abilities to be able to upload documents, and we will need to put processes in place in the background to check that documentation to ensure that it's valid. And so that will be the workaround for those examples where we just won't have the standard in place and a digital certificate isn't issued, which we know is going to be the case.
Okay. And Alexandre, maybe a question for you. In the travelers survey, about just over 2/3 claimed that their quality of life has been impacted by the travel restrictions that have been put in place by governments. Did that statistic surprise you? Did you think it would be more or less, roughly what you were expecting? And what are the implications for that of how policymakers think about the industry?
No, I'm not surprised at all by the statistics, and having two-thirds of the people surveyed saying that their quality of life has been negatively impacted is a good sign that this industry is important for the well-being of a large number of people. You know, our famous motto that it's the business of freedom is not an invention. It is a reality that is demonstrated by this figure.
Okay. And then another question about the survey results. They seem to indicate that travelers are willing to accept some managed risk or more managed risk in the travel, in being able to reopen borders. How important do you think it is for governments do you see governments sort of moving in the same direction, or is public opinion ahead of where governments are on this issue?
It's a difficult question because there are we see two strategies regarding COVID. You have the zero COVID strategy, which means zero risk, and the consequent measures, which is mainly to lock down the country or to close completely the borders. And you have the second family of strategies, which is reducing and managing the risk, which suppose and which implies, to maintain some openness in for the population inside and on the borders. So it's not these two strategies are not compatible when you think about that, because it will be difficult to establish a significant communication and flow of people between the two blocks. Those who are zero COVID and those who are which are managing the risk, and so that will have some cases. Even if the number of cases, number of infection, and the consequences of the infection are under control, which could be the outcome of a good vaccination policy. So that's it's a difficult point, as we think that the policy to manage risk looks more realistic, and we have worked in that respect when we propose, the IATA travel pass, when we ask government for reopening plan or roadmaps to reopen, consistent with their vaccination and testing strategy, because we think that is more compatible with the fluent or with a significant air travel and strong air travel.
Okay. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. So one question, Alexandre, looking ahead, we're mid-March almost now. We have the Easter holiday coming up, and then we have the Northern Summer vacation. Are you optimistic that either of those might be a significant improvement in traffic?
Frankly, I think that Easter is too soon. It's coming too early, and that the states will not have reopened their borders in 1 month. For the summer season, we are more optimistic when we look at the rollout of the vaccination policy in many developed countries. I think it's compatible with the reopening plan that would allow the summer season to be at least a decent season for air transport. So we think that the beginning of the recovery should start by mid-year 2021. So for the summer season of the Northern Hemisphere.
Okay, and then maybe the last question is, any thoughts on the development of business travel? Do you see that as, do you see companies as sending their staff back to traveling earlier or later?
But probably not yet for the first of all, because borders are not open. Secondly, you have still the strong influence of all the virtual tools we are using. Thirdly, there is a very big motivation for business travel, which are the events, congress, conferences, whatever, that have completely disappeared, and that will start to recover by the end of 2021, not before. And fourth point, many companies have slashed their travel budget very hard. So business travel will not recover immediately. What we think is that it will recover at a good level, but not before before a few years, and probably 12 to 18 months after the travel for personal motives, whether it's tourism or visiting friends and relatives and all the personal reasons that might motivate an individual to travel. Business travel will happen afterwards.
Okay, thanks very much, Alexandre. And then the last question, we'll go back to a regional one, and I'll ask Brian to help in responding to this. It's looking at specifically, Brazil, but Latin America. And with the spread of variants, we saw some opening up, maybe some retraction on that. Do you see, Brian, how do you see the prognosis for the market in Brazil?
Well, I think we've seen that domestic markets, we can see travel. There's clearly a willingness for people to fly. The big issue is with international borders, and so I think for the Latin American region, the big issue is whether their international markets will be open. So the slower rollout of the vaccine in at least some of the Latin American countries, not all, Chile is quite advanced, will slow down the recovery in that region.
Okay, thanks very much, Brian. I think with that, we'll have to call today's briefing to an end. We've exhausted pretty much the questions in the queue, and I know Alexandre has an appointment that he needs a few minutes to get to. So with that, I'll thank everybody for their participation today.